Ladies and gentlemen, Session 1, Divinity, Reimagined, our first speaker. Andrew M. Davis is Program Director for the Center for Process Studies at Claremont School of Theology, where he earned his PhD in Religion and Process Philosophy. As Program Director, Davis researches, writes, teaches, and organizes conferences like this one across process relational thought. He's the author and editor of several books, including Mind, Value, and Cosmos, on the relational nature of ultimacy, Nature in Process, Organic Proposals in Philosophy, Society, and Religion, Process Cosmology, New Integrations in Science and Philosophy, and Whitehead's Universe, Philosophical Foundations of Process Theology, forthcoming. You can follow his work at andrewmdavis.info. Did you write that down? The paper title, God as Eternal Becoming, McGilchrist's Hemispheric Process Panentheism. Andrew.
Well, friends, Alfred North Whitehead was nothing short of a process polymath. The Sage of Ramsgate, as some of his friends like to refer to him. But of course, he was not the only one. After all, it's often the case that one polymath gives rise to another. I would say that's certainly been the case in the modern process tradition, broadly considered. So this morning, what I'd like to do is consider some of the philosophical and theological contributions of a more recent process polymath by the name of Ian McGilchrist, a psychiatrist, a philosopher, a neuroscience researcher, and himself, I would say, the sage of the Isle of Skye on the northwestern coast of Scotland. See, in my estimation, Ian McGilchrist's recent work titled The Matter with Things constitutes one of the most significant contributions to the contemporary process tradition, as revealed through layers of neuroscientific data and decades of remarkable research into brain lateralization and the hemisphere hypothesis. Drawing from multiple disciplines across science and philosophy, and from both ancient and modern philosophers, from Heraclitus to Schelling, James, Bergson, Whitehead, and a chorus of others, McGilchrist has revealed himself to be a formidable process thinker committed to restoring the qualitative, the intuitive, relational, and fluid modes of thought associated with the right hemisphere, and relativizing the quantitative, the rational, the piecemeal, the static methods associated with the left hemisphere. Of course, he's quick to stress that both hemispheres, right and left, are involved in everything that we do. But this should not be taken to mean that there are no differences between them, as some have argued. It is not what each hemisphere does, but how it does it that matters, McGilchrist states. Each hemisphere is involved in everything, just in quite a different way. McGilchrist has demonstrated at length that the relationship between the right and left hemispheres is fundamentally asymmetrical in nature, with the right hemisphere functioning as a true master in providing an overwhelmingly more reliable and meaningful portrait of the world, and the left hemisphere functioning merely as an emissary to the right's inclusive wisdom. And this relationship was signaled in his 2009 opus titled The Master and His Emissary. As McGilchrist puts it, there is an asymmetry. The right hemisphere's take is in no sense a special case of the left hemisphere's, but that of the left hemisphere is a special case of the right hemisphere, which already includes it. Nevertheless, he argues that precisely the inverse relationship has prevailed across our disciplines in the modern world. We have elevated the methods of the left hemisphere as dominant, and in so doing are threatening our civilizational future. Seeing the respective worlds that are created by the hemispheres in their proper asymmetrical relationship is thus not simply a matter of science or philosophy, although it is that, but ultimately a matter of truth and survival. While McGilchrist draws from a wealth of sources in applying his research to metaphysical problems, in the second volume of The Matter with Things being his major contribution to metaphysics, it's clear that Whitehead's philosophy and the insights of process philosophy and theology more broadly are an abiding influence on his work. and indeed deeply supportive of his own affirmations of the ontological irreducibility of relationality, time, value, purpose, experience, consciousness, and the sacred, all convictions that are supported by the perceptual holism of the right hemisphere. In responding to a common prejudice that process theology is a modern invention, McGilchrist responds saying, perhaps it is in its current forms, there are many. However, he also rightly emphasizes that process theology has many resonances with an array of traditions, including pre-Socratic philosophy, Heraclitus in particular, his favorite philosopher, Taoism, Buddhism, including Zen, Judaism, medieval Christian mysticism from Kusa to Eckhart and others, the philosophies of Hegel and Schelling, the writings of Wordsworth and Coleridge, the philosophies of James, Bergson, and of course, Whitehead. He recognizes Whitehead in particular as the figure generally credited with originating process theology as such. Now, McGilchrist fully agrees with Whitehead's insistence that the elucidation in the meaning involved in the phrase, all things flow, is one chief task of metaphysics. I follow him in seeing process and relationships, not things themselves, as fundamental entities, he states. On this view, relations are prior to relata, such that dynamic relationships are not only more important than the entities related, but ontologically prior to them, so that, he states, what we call things arise out of a web of interconnectedness, not the web out of the things. Again, such convictions for McGilchrist are the metaphysical correlates of the perceptual data provided by the right hemisphere. In asking whether this process relational vision can tell us something about the nature of God, McGilchrist answers affirmatively, saying, Whitehead thought so. So too does McGilchrist. He stresses that a disposition towards God in the first place is dependent upon the right hemisphere, the hemisphere that we know brings us closer to truth than the left. But which God is it that the right hemisphere reveals? It's certainly not the all-controlling, unmoved mover that is independent, unrelated, and wholly transcendent in relation to the world, for this is precisely the kind of dysfunctional deistic or theistic God the left hemisphere is fond of projecting. Nor is a wholly immanent pantheism where all things are God and God is all things an adequate rendering of God's relationship to the world. For McGilchrist, each of these notions suffer to the extent that the central element of relationship is lost. McGilchrist instead considers the fruitfulness of panentheism, where all things are in God and God is in all things. Earlier in his opus, The Master and His Emissary, he recognized panentheism as a long tradition belonging to Romanticism, but in no way confined to it. Not only is panentheism, he states, evident in Christianity from the Desert Fathers onward, it is also evident in many other religions, perhaps especially Buddhism. And he states it reaches a high level of intellectual sophistication in the philosophy of A.N. Whitehead. Now, McGilchrist deepens his engagement with panentheism substantially in his recent volume, The Matter with Things, where he emphasizes panentheism as a position that does not abstract or collapse together God and the world, or transcendence and immanence, but rather preserves them through relational union. Panentheism, he states, permits something further, the possibility that God has a relationship not just with the divine self, but with something other. And this, he states, it seems to me, is the drive behind there being a creation at all. For we need immanence, yes, which pantheism offers, but we need the union of transcendence with immanence, which only some form of panentheism encompasses. Yet again, he states, we need union, but we need that to be the union of division with union. Panentheism here expresses a conceptual framework that preserves the coincidence of opposites, the coincidentia oppositorum, as one of the most fundamental doctrines of McGilchrist's metaphysics. Still, he's quick to remind us that the whole discipline of theology, all the attempts to conceptualize, to rationalize, to categorize God, is left hemisphere activity, and thus vulnerable to all its worst defects, not least dogmatism, narrowness, and a drive for certainty. Guarding against this, McGilchrist speaks of panentheism instead as theological speculation, a theological category or a representation by the left hemisphere of something that is intuited by the right. As a speculative theology, therefore, panentheism for him is not a source of argument, but a source of wonder. It should not, therefore, be taken as gospel or as certain. Now, this humility notwithstanding, there is still a form of argument at play here, since panentheism for McGilchrist does envision a concept of God that is arguably more amenable to the intuitions of the right hemisphere. These intuitions are at home in process theology. Process theology, he states, is put very simply, the belief that the divine is misconceived as a purely static entity outside time, though that is an accepted aspect of divinity, and is, at least in some important respects, better seen as a process within time, an eternal becoming rather than merely an eternal being, though it is that too. Here again we see McGilchrist stressing the union of eternity and temporality, of being and becoming in God. Process theology, he continues, is a natural counterpart or companion to panentheism, since it too implies that God is in everything without being reducible to the sum of everything, the spring and that which comes forth from the spring. It is this kind of theological vision that McGilchrist finds suggested by the right hemisphere. And here I quote, "Process theology is also suggested by the hemisphere hypothesis. For what the left hemisphere knows is secondary to whatever the right hemisphere knows. What the left hemisphere sees as finished, perfect, single, abstract, detached, motionless, beyond space and time, is what, according to the right hemisphere, is always evolving, ever both self-differentiating and self-unifying, and involved with the process of creation and what it creates. For McGilchrist, this hemispheric wisdom also transforms how divine knowledge and power are understood. Whereas knowledge, according to the left hemisphere, is already to have something fixed and represented in memory or pinned down, knowledge, according to the right hemisphere, is a process of openness and receptivity, one that is undetermined and free. Similarly, divine power, according to the left hemisphere, is to have the ability to interfere in the course of things and manipulate an intended outcome. Whereas power, as understood by the right hemisphere, is permissive. What he says is a creative power, a power that allows things to come into being precisely by underwriting the existence of a creative field, but not interfering or manipulating with it. These are statements that I would suggest resonate deeply with Whitehead's own vision of God's relation and interaction with the universe. According to McGilchrist, Whitehead saw God as the principle that made possible and was expressed in the newness of creation, the presence of order in complexity, and of purpose within the cosmos. What is more, he understands very clearly Whitehead's dialectical vision where God and the world fulfill each other and bring each other into being, such that, he states, the one eternal becomes many and ceaselessly changing, just as the many and ceaselessly changing become one and eternal. In quoting Whitehead's famous lines that it is as true to say that God creates the world as that the world creates God, and that God and the world are the instrument of novelty for each other, McGilchrist fully recognizes the collective responsibility, indeed the co-creative communal imperative that we as world have in light of this mutual relationship. If God is an eternal becoming, fulfilled as God through the response of his creation, and we, for our part, constantly more fulfilled through our response to God, then we are literally partners in the creation of the universe, partners even in the becoming of God, who is himself becoming as much as being. In which case, it is imperative, he continues, that we try to reach out and know and love that God, not just for our own sakes, but because we bear some responsibility, however small, for the part we play in creation. And indeed, how big or small, he says, we cannot know, such terms being derived from our limited experience of a finite world. These are humble and moving statements that I suggest are uttered by one of the most important process philosophers and theologians of our time, one that is acutely aware of what a relational universe involves and what it requires of us all, both human and divine. Now, what can we say by way of assessment? There are, of course, a number of perspectives or angles from which to approach McGilchrist's hemispheric process metaphysics. It's clear to me that he's offered an eminently laudable development of process philosophy and theology, providing not only empirical support for the kind of universe that Whitehead imagines, but also support for his understanding of God through an imaginative theological extension of hemispheric research. This is a move that I find entirely consistent with Whitehead's own method of imaginative generalization from the data of human experience. In a way, then, I see McGilchrist's work as one monumental appeal to Whitehead's fallacy of misplaced concreteness, as applied to the perceptual data of the hemisphere hypothesis. As long as we continue to abstract and reify the left hemisphere's construction of the world over and against that of the right, we stand committed to half-truths, and indeed less than half-truths, since the right hemisphere is asymmetrically inclusive of the left in ways that the left is not of the right. Whitehead reminds us there are no whole truths, all truths are half-truths. It is trying to treat them as whole truths that plays the devil. So he asks us, have we not played with the devil of abstraction enough already? Overall, I see McGilchrist's project as a significant step forward for philosophy and science, as he hoped it would be, as well as a step forward for process philosophy and theology in particular. Now, having said this, I do want to mention at least two oversights that I discern that are involved in McGilchrist's utilization of Whitehead, the importance of which might arguably deepen his insights still further. And the first is more philosophical in nature, the second more theological. First, McGilchrist knows of Whitehead's theory of perception, certainly, but he does not deeply engage it. And this is somewhat unfortunate, I think, because Whitehead's theory of perception appears to share at least striking prima facie resonances with the perceptual orientations of the left and right hemisphere. In brief, what Whitehead names perception in the mode of presentational immediacy corresponds to the narrow but defined perceptual grasp of the left hemisphere. And what he names perception in the mode of causal efficacy corresponds to the intuitive width and relational inclusivity of the right. Admittedly, these are not perfect correspondences, but they are correspondences nonetheless. For Whitehead, only through the integration of presentational immediacy and causal efficacy through symbolic reference is our high-level conscious perception possible. As has recently been argued by David E. Roy, Whitehead's theory of perception may provide a theoretical foundation for contemporary neuroscience in ways that include, complement, and perhaps exceed the remarkable findings of McGilchrist and others. Now, McGilchrist rightly denies the charge that he is inappropriately dichotomizing the left and right hemisphere, as he insists nature got there before me. Indeed, the two hemispheres might be seen as yet another example of the ways in which the universe is dual in precisely the way that Whitehead says it is. It remains, I think, an interesting question as to whether we might see the left and right hemispheres of the brain as a physical manifestation of Whitehead's dual theory of perception. And McGilchrist, I trust, would take interest in that question. Now, second, McGilchrist does not deeply engage or elucidate the primordial and consequent nature of Whitehead's God in relation to his theological wonder and the hemisphere hypothesis. While it's clear that he understands God as the coincidentia oppositorum, and thus as the confluence of being and becoming, eternity and temporality, it strikes me that a more explicit treatment and or comparison of Whitehead's characterizations of the primordial and consequent natures in relation to those of the right and left hemispheres might yield new insights and perhaps...
2 minutes.
Thank you. And perhaps reveal the ways in which God too can be conceived as hemispherically divided but ultimately united. Still, the sources of McGilchrist's work remain much wider than Whitehead, and these oversights are best seen as simply catalysts towards deeper research that integrates these two eminent process polymaths. And here I should say that my colleague Matt Siegel and I are now in the early stages of a 2024 conference potentially that will critically engage McGilchrist's work as a contribution to process philosophy and theology. And we hope to bring him and a variety of other process thinkers to the California Institute for Integral Studies. So do stay tuned for that. And I'll end then with a final remark. Should the 21st century become the Whiteheadian century that David Ray Griffin speculated it might only a few short years ago on the Pomona steps behind us, just a couple blocks away, I think it will be due, at least in part, to the pioneering work and vision of Ian McGilchrist. Thank you very much.